Hillary has been lengthening her excuses as to why she lost the election. She didn't really lose the election. It was stolen from her by, I think it's up to 24 different excuses she has now. Number 24 is content farms in Macedonia. And as I said, my grandfather was a Macedonian content farmer, and we often think about, gathering on the porch and recalling the old days on the Macedonian he never thought that the old content farmers he left behind in Macedonia would one day steal the U.S. presidential election. They are gnarled, hard-working Macedonian...
The putative Prime Minister of Macedonia, whose name we shall not utter, has been tweeting furiously about Macedonia's Independence Day with precious little mention of the country celebrating independence. In the past week, he tweeted about the big celebration his government is holding in Skopje's Gradski Park and all of the fun people will have there. He tweeted about hosting children from Kole Nedelkovski Primary School in Skopje at the government building to watch the raising of the flag and the playing of the national anthem of this nameless state. And he tweeted out a graphic of the, quote, colors of independence, unquote, again, of that nameless state. In fairness to him, he also tweeted out the following, quote, "The Republic of Northern Macedonia gained its independence as the Republic of Macedonia on September 8, 1991, as a result of the responsibility and commitment of generations of citizens who fought for freedom and sovereignty. Their engagement is an inspiration to us today and to future generations," unquote. And here's our point. Macedonians did, indeed, vote for the independence of the Republic of Macedonia on September 8, 1991, and the government honored the consent of the governed, a hallmark of any democracy, by recognizing that vote. But 27 years later, on September 30, 2018, the Macedonians told the government in no uncertain terms that the name of the Republic of Macedonia shall not be changed. And yet the government ignored the consent of the governed and, using bribes, threats, arrests, and general intimidation, overturned the will of the people in the chambers of the parliament, whose legal role is to be representative of the people, and they in turn voted to change the name despite having no authority to do so. This leads us to the oft-told story about one of America's founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin. Upon leaving the Constitutional Convention in 1787, a certain Mrs. Powell of Philadelphia asked Franklin, "Well, doctor, what have we got? A republic or a monarchy?" Whereupon the old doctor sagely replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." We'll discuss all of this and little else on this special Independence Day episode of the Macedonian Content Farmers Podcast. I'm Jason Miko, coming to you from the foot of the Catalina Mountains in Oro Valley, Arizona.
And this is Cvetin and calling in from Skopje, the Republic of Macedonia.
Amen to the Republic of Macedonia, and a happy Independence Day for the Republic of Macedonia to you, Cvetin, and to your family, and to our listeners.
Thank you. It's a very important holiday to appreciate. At times like this, I suppose we didn't appreciate it as much when the country was not directly under threat as it is now, especially its sovereignty and independence. But now you really,
Indeed.
once you lose it, you really get an idea of what you have lost and what you have to try to preserve.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And and last year, so it was a year ago today that I was in Macedonia. I think I arrived on the late evening of the 7th. So I was there for the 8th and spoke to an audience, one of the rallies in front of the Parliament building, and said, "Is that the last time that we are celebrating the independence of the Republic of Macedonia?" Well, obviously, most thinking people and most Macedonians are always going to celebrate the independence of the Republic of Macedonia, no matter what this current government says or does. And as I have written and talked about, as you have written and talked about, I think we're both agreed that eventually at some point, this whole thing is going to be overturned. It's going to be through incrementalism and time. But let's start, why not, with Dr. Frank, the question posed to Dr. Franklin regarding the founding of the American states. And what do we have, a republic or a monarchy? It seems today, Cvetin, that Macedonia, which is a quote-unquote republic, is actually indeed a monarchy, because all of the hallmarks of a small l liberal democracy, a representative republic, which is the consent of the governed, free speech, free and independent media, judiciary that is not controlled by the legislative or the executive power, freedom from arrest, intimidation, etc. All of these things, which are hallmarks of democracy, seem to be under threat by the monarch Zoran Zaev.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the way they're operating, there's obviously no constraint on the executive, on the government, especially in the judiciary, where we really have something like the king's law from past times. Whoever the king says is guilty or innocent. Even the king himself, who had to request clemency or pardons from the previous king, Branko Crvenkovski, once, and then from afterwards from the judges he would appoint. So yeah, I mean, in this regard, we're far away from a limited, restrained executive in this country.
Yeah, and again, that's going. I didn't mention that, but I'm glad you mentioned the word limited, because limited government, and that is a hallmark of any democracy. And it seems that this current government of Macedonia just seems to be all-encompassing and gathering or attempting to gather more and more powers, whether it is control of the judiciary, as you were talking about there. And of course, we don't want to talk too much about the current scandal, because there's so many little details going on there, and it's just ongoing and whatnot, and it threatens so many different aspects of life in Macedonia. But yes, limited government, and the current government of Macedonia under Zoran Zaev is not limited in scope or power or anything else, and it just seems to be gobbling up as much power as it can.
Actually, if you go back, if you're looking for a model, we haven't had a king for more than 100 years after we foolishly expelled the Sultan. I mean, it's all been
all is forgiven.
It's all been downhill since then. But yeah, if you're looking for a totalitarian model here, it's the communist style police state, which we're seeing here reimagined in a grotesque, maybe comical reincarnation, but still it has a lot of the usual elements of totalitarianism. And of course, I mean, the left would say that Gruevski was also an autocratic leader, but I mean, it's just incomparable. The number of opposition leaders which are arrested, the officials who are arrested, the number of journalists who are targeted, threatened. I mean, it's this. We're not going to talk about the scandal, but the essence of it is that there practically wasn't a business small enough which you couldn't blackmail and you couldn't extort money from, because Boki would go after the biggest guys, but there were smaller, lower level businessmen who they would extort 10, 20, 50,000 euros from. So nothing like this was imaginable under Gruevski. So not to mention kings would rename cities, would rename the months of the year after themselves. Central Asian sultans would do that. I mean, even now, presidents in Central Asia. The level of totalitarianism required to rename the entire country, and then oftentimes U.S. diplomats like Phil Ricker would tell us, yeah, but it's just the name, and then you would join the EU and NATO, and then from this position you would be able to reverse it. But now we see that this also includes a rewriting of the history books. Now, it's very difficult.
Yes.
You really have to go pretty well back into history or pretty far east into Central Asia to find a president who would who would have the power to order the schools to rewrite the history books. I mean, that's...
Well, yeah.
I mean, that's the essence of totalitarianism. It's not autocratic, it's not necessarily violent, although there is a lot of violence involved in this. The totalitarianism means that everything is managed by the state. Everything depends on the state. Nothing is outside of the state. And this is what we have now.
Yeah, well, yes, and you bring up the changing of history, as we've talked about in the past, the changing, how Greece and Bulgaria are basically demanding that Macedonia school books, curriculum, maps, atlases, teaching guides, all of that be changed in accordance with Greek and Bulgarian view of history. And you've got committees, that are working to do this, and I'm reminded of the quote I think I had on the podcast last week from Nikola Dimitrov when he was the ambassador to the United States. This is in 2002, and he basically said that history should be left to the historians, not to the politicians, and yet here he is now in the government as foreign minister, actively working with other politicians to change history. And then you mentioned, how the kings would change the names of months and streets and cities, things like that. That goes back to the French Revolution of 1789, of course, where the Jacobins and Robespierre and his crew they not only did they change the names of the months and things like that, but they also started with a brand new calendar. That was year zero for them. I don't think they changed the name of the state then, but it's interesting and this is going back a little bit. We like to talk about Edmund Burke and how he warned against the French Revolution, whereas a number of folks here in America, including Thomas Jefferson, our third president, were very much in favor of the French Revolution. But Burke saw what was coming. He knew that the Jacobins and those that wanted to tear down the state, they didn't like the king, they didn't like the past, etc. And so they and there were abuses from the king and his class, the ruling class, etc. But they tore everything down. They tore down the past. They tore down history, and they wanted to start from scratch. And you cannot do that. Every country, every people, every society throughout all of time have had good and bad in the past, and you can't just wipe it all out and start over. That's insane. And you don't learn that way, because there's things to be learned from the past. And this is, I think, to your point, what Zaev is doing. He is trying to eliminate the entire past of Macedonia by wiping it out. And his whole goal, and not just Zaev, but the people in his government and others in Macedonia, they think that NATO and EU membership is the end-all be-all, and that is infinitely more important than the past, than history, than culture, than heritage, than the name. And I can't quite get my head wrapped around why they think these things.
And
it's
NATO
not just
will not. We see countries trying to leave the European Union. We see countries within NATO who are fighting each other, going to war with each other, like Turkey and Greece, but also having pretty significant internal conflicts, like Turkey, or secessionist movements like Spain, the United Kingdom, etc. So certainly it was not the case that during the Cold War that the NATO countries would support each other in, let's say, the colonial fights. Often they would fight each other, even though they were nominally on the same team in NATO. And joining you in NATO will do nothing for the huge historical moment which the Albanians believe they're in right now with their expansionist nationalism, or these two new problems which we just kicked off, or the problems were there, but we are making them worse precipitously in the past several years with the Bulgarian and the Greek requests toward Macedonian history, which will inevitably lead to territorial claims by Bulgaria, or Greece trying to implement its old plan to have the Macedonia partition. So we are actively making matters worse in a way that it's very unlikely that NATO will help us. I mean, the two major security crises we had, 2001 and 2015, the Kosovo attack, they were both, the Kumanov attack, they were both coming from Kosovo, which is NATO protectorate, and literally the armed groups were crossing the border under the nose of the largest American military base in the region, and nothing changed. So what, are we to believe that when we are in NATO, and this was while we were NATO allies, if we will be in NATO, but are we going to order the Americans to stop allowing Albanian terrorists to cross the border, while Zaev is daily going to have to meet Ramush Haradinaj in Kosovo? I mean, it's not going to change. We are giving ourselves up to something which is precisely the opposite of being an independent country. We are quickly turning ourselves into a dependence to anybody and everybody around us, and no amount of EU and NATO membership would help us there.
Well, yes, and you bring up a good point there, and it's not just not just Macedonia. So let's kind of take a step back here, look at it from a 30,000 foot, 10,000 meter perspective, and this issue of sovereignty. And you mentioned Brexit there, and the UK is divided, although 52% to 48% voted to leave in 2016, and Brexit means Brexit, according to Theresa May, the former PM, and yet the European Union and certain Remainers in the UK are doing everything in their power to thwart the will of the people, the consent of the governed. And all in the name, well, of course, the EU is doing this because they fear that if the UK is allowed to leave, then this will encourage others to leave and their whole precious little project will come crashing down. And that's a very real possibility. And they have legitimate fears there. But it's because the European Union is becoming an increasingly authoritarian, I might even say totalitarian institution. This idea of pooled sovereignty, ever closer union, more Europe, etc., where they are taking away powers from the individual sovereign states, the parliaments of the individual sovereign states. Charlie Cook over at National Review makes a very good point about this, and he's an American citizen, but he's British. So he grew up in the UK, and obviously he follows the situation over there very closely. And he makes the point that a parliament, any parliament, has temporary and loaned powers. They are loaned to the parliament from the people. And that means in turn that a parliament, any parliament, cannot then turn around and loan those powers to another parliament or another authority, which is exactly what the European Union is doing. So the government, let's just take let's take France, for instance. France has an elected parliament.
I think it's the Grand National Assembly or something like that.
Okay. So let's say the Assembly of the Parliament in France is elected by the people. The people have loaned power temporarily to their elected representatives, and they in turn are turning around and giving that to unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats in Brussels. You cannot do that, which is why I think the Brits especially have seen they're tired of this, and they want to take their sovereignty back. And this is something, we've talked about. I'm reading more about it. I'm actually working on a kind of this longish paper, I think, is what's going to come out of it, based on things that the Polish MEP, Ryszard Legutko, John Mearsheimer of, I think, Hoover or Stanford, others have written about how liberal democracy, small L liberal democracy, we're classical liberals, has a tendency to move towards a form of benign authoritarianism. And it has a lot, and this is something that Legutko writes about in The Demon of Democracy, how more and more liberal democracy has more and more in common with Soviet communism and totalitarianism. And they're both universalist in their outlook. It's both an ideology, an ideology of there's only one way, their way, and any dissent must be crushed, which of course is the opposite of what a liberal democracy is. And I think part of it, and I'm kind of on a rant here right now, I think part of it is that, and this is something that the Irish author Os Guinness talks quite a bit about, in what we talked about earlier, limits. There have to be limits. There have to be boundaries. There have to be rules in our families, in our personal lives, in our families, in our neighborhoods, in our cities, in our states. If you have no limits, then everything is up for grabs. And that is what, within liberal democracy, that is one vein that is moving towards that, and that's the vein that's going towards this benign authoritarianism, which refuses to impose any limits on itself or its appetite, and is moving towards, to Legutko's point, is moving towards more and more authoritarianism and communism. I think our friend Rod Brer writes about this as well, the American conservative. And so that, I think, kind of is really, we talk about at the beginning a monarchy versus a republic. A monarchy obviously is a form of authoritarianism, totalitarianism. And yet that is where this whole project called small L liberal democracy seems to be moving in the West today. And that is not a good thing. And right now I need to refill my glass.
Fortunately, my glass is still full, so I can pick up. I never realized. I remain bitter and angry over the acquisition of the word liberal by the left, and I'm not sure what they want to say by liberal democracy. I have to get to the Google machine sometime and try to fish out the first time they started using this word, because it's relatively recent. It was just democracy before. We would say pluralism as opposed to one-party rule we had here. But then we just adopted democracy, and that's we never had to qualify it by liberal. Liberalism normally means openness to change as opposed to conservatism. But historically it was
Right.
The situation of the society has moved in some direction, and then the government, the state, the administrative apparatus needs to accommodate to the change which already happened. We're not seeing this right now. We're seeing a situation where the administrative apparatus is driving the change. It's not like they are the conservative element in society. In fact, society has not moved toward population replacement, has not moved toward phasing out fossil fuels. People like their fossil fuels. Thank you very much. We have.
If you like your fossil fuels, you can keep your fossil
They
fossil
haven't
fuels.
moved toward redefining marriage, at least not universally. It's usually the courts in the US, it's the bureaucracy in the European Union, which has to drive these things, often to the opposition of the people. And then, we're down to the other definition of liberal right now, which is this unfortunate situation where the left in the US has adopted the word liberal, because progressivism has been tainted by a lot of abuse and violence and carnage and death around the world, not to mention socialism and communism. So they're always looking for a new word as soon as the old word they were using is tainted, and which happens often. And now they've opted on liberalism, forcing us, the actual liberals, to adopt libertarianism in some situations. But so now, it's liberalism as the U.S. left, and the word liberalism understood as the word for the U.S. left. Liberal democracy would now mean left-wing democracy.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's the whole redefinition of language, whichever language, English or others, is something that we see is an increasingly it's increasingly a battlefront every day. And so it's funny. Our friends down in Oz, in Australia, the Conservative Party is the Liberal Party. And you see that in other places as well. But yeah. So and I tell people that I'm a classical liberal. If they don't understand that, I tell them I'm a Reagan Republican. That seems to be easily understood. But one thing, I want to go back to the Brexit thing for a moment and talk about something. I watched listened to actually a podcast the other day between our friend Tom Coffey from the Heritage Foundation, who spent some time in England working with Dr. Liam Fox when he was the defense minister, and Amanda Sloat, I'm not sure how you pronounce her name, Brookings. A lot of Macedonians know that name, Amanda Sloat, and suspect that she was part of the whole so-called Prespa agreement. But it's interesting, the two of them were debating Brexit. And it was an interesting conversation and whatnot. And the hard part that I had with listening to it was I just wished Amanda would come out and say, look, I'm anti-sovereigntist, I'm anti-nation state. But she wouldn't. She couched it in so many terms and whatnot. And I'm going to, this is a public admission, I have a real hard time not attributing evil motives to our friends on the other side who are anti-sovereignty. And look, we're all fallen individuals. We're all part of the crooked timber of humanity, as Kant said. We're all sinners. And bad people can do good things and good people can do bad things. But our friends on that side who are essentially anti-sovereigntist, I think, whether or not they have evil motives or not, I don't know. But I do know one thing, Cvetin. They are addicted to their cushy jobs that they have in the think tanks, in academia, in the media, in non-elected positions in government, and they're addicted to the international first-class travel, the fancy hotels, the movable feast that is their daily lives, where they can listen to the sound of their voice in a bubble, and they're a mutual admiration society where they, go from one movable feast to the other. Carl Bildt, of course, the former Prime Minister of Sweden, is the poster boy for this because he's always tweeting out a picture from the tarmac of some airport where he's about ready to get on a jumbo jet to fly to some other exotic location where he can lecture the little people and mutually reinforce his ideas and thoughts with people that are like-minded. And I think that's where the whole that's their whole class, is that they're all in this bubble, kind of like what the former advisor to President Obama, Ben Rhodes, talks a lot about, and who admitted it actually. And so they're not necessarily evil, and I've got to be careful about that, but they are addicted to this nice lifestyle.
We all have our faults, but at least on our side, the operating principle is that you get into other people's hair as little as possible. Whereas on their side, they want to run everything and control everything. The best the least you can do, or the best you can do maybe. Once you realize that you're fallen and prone to abuse, etc., is to try to run as little things as possible when you're in position of authority. This is the principle of conservatism or actual classical liberalism. Whereas the left, they want to run more and more things, no matter the fact that whatever they touch is the reverse Midas touch. It doesn't actually turn into gold. I tagged her like a few days ago, Sloat. You just reminded me. I was just checking out the tweet here. She had a list of tweets about the United Kingdom, what's happening there, fine. And then in the end she says, but none of this addresses the fundamental question of whitter Brexit. I mean, how do we get rid of Brexit? I mean, they actually voted in a referendum, and you want to do away with it. Just as in Macedonia, we refused to vote in the referendum quite clearly, and still she wrote this Prespa Treaty, and they still impose it on us, despite the fact that we were clearly opposed to it. And my comment was, you really like undermining referendums, don't you? You have something against, because at this point, we win elections like in the US or now in Italy, and then we see them, or our side broadly defined, and we see them taken, the outcome taken away from us through the administrative state, which in the US is in open warfare against the elected the elected president and Congress.
The president.
In Italy we see that a guy who is popular like all other parties combined, he's now being cheated away from a way of the prime ministership, which if you hold elections would absolutely he would win it in a landslide. So this is the tool we have right now, the referendum, and you can just see that this actually illiberal elite, which has appropriated this honorable word, is so livid at the idea of holding referendums. And it's going to end so badly because, I mean, they realize that the native populations of Europe, the United States, no longer vote for them. This is where what it all comes down to, with the drop of support for the Socialist Party, Social Democratic parties, the Democratic Party in the U.S., etc. And this is why they're reaching out for this type of tools, for using the administrative state, the courts, the judiciary, and buying time until they are, especially in Europe, able to open the borders and bring in the required number of immigrants who would vote for them. They figure that, the left figures that immigrants vote for them in sufficient numbers
because
sure.
of the generous welfare state.
And cultural, I mean, even if they're culturally conservative, they would still, I mean, it's weird. We have to go into this deeper sometime, why the culturally conservative immigrants, especially Muslims in Europe, Latinos in the U.S., vote for the liberals. I mean, my gut feeling is that they like seeing the liberal policies applied to the native population, because essentially it reduces the numbers and it elevates the position of the immigrants. I mean, why wouldn't you be for abortion? Because you figure that you would stop your own tribe, your own people in your own immigrant community from the women there from having abortions. While on the other hand, you say, well, why would they be opposed to the natives having to the French, the Germans, the Italians having more abortions? More. I'm in this obviously to do what every civilization, every culture, every people from the dawn of time have done: expand my own seed, expand my own family. And here I have countries which have perfect infrastructure, everything is pre-built, and obviously the native populations are in withdrawal. Why wouldn't I come here and expand? And liberal policies, if applied toward the native population, especially in the left-wing approach toward family values, it's they're perfect fit with a conservative immigrant population which wants to, expand essentially.
You bring up some very good points there, and again, you call it the administrative state. We've heard others call it the deep state. I think James Buchanan wrote about the managerial state. Whatever you want to call it, yeah, it is that class that we talked about earlier of unelected, unaccountable, and politicians who actually are elected. But whether it's the media, think tanks, academia, bureaucrats, etc., that are all very protective of their lifestyle, and they want power. And you mentioned the immigrant issue of illegal immigrants coming into Europe, coming into America, and how this administrative state, managerial class, welcomes them because they see them as potential voters in the future. And that's exactly what they are. And you mentioned that it's all going to end very badly, and it will, because whereas these progressive liberals, big L, sit in their nice, fancy offices, etc., and welcome the folks coming in and then signing them up to be voters, etc. At some point, this progressive big L liberal class is going to be thrown out one way or the other by those that they are welcoming in one way or the other. And so, yes, I do think it's all going to end very badly. Plus, of course, the whole diluting of a nation's culture. And this is the late Samuel Huntington talked a lot about this, in his book, The Clash of Civilizations, how you've got to have some sort of agreement in a society, in a state, and some continuity in the religion, in the culture, in the language, etc. Otherwise, the whole thing is going to come undone.
Yeah, in the UK and in Italy, the referendum in the UK, it came at the height of the migrant crisis, and it was clearly, like it or not, a vote to end the open border regime with the European Union. The Brits saw that the EU is not serious about managing its own borders, on top of disliking being joined in a open borders regime with the rest of the European Union, with Eastern Europe, etc. Now they're obviously unserious about policing their borders with the Middle East and North Africa and Central Asia and wherever. And they voted to Brexit. And I'm absolutely sure that the referendum would have failed if it weren't held in the height of the migrant crisis. And, you could say it's cheating on our side, but then, it revealed a very fundamental problem of the European Union. And if not now, it would have bubbled up later. So, if not in 2016, it would have shown up later. So they had absolutely every right to vote in this direction. So did the Italians, which they saw ships disembarking every other day from Libya, and they said basta. And they're still saying basta, but their managerial elite, deep state, Gladio, whatever you want to call it, they decided, no, your vote doesn't count. And this is an exceptional, extremely fundamental issue to be playing with. The people couldn't have been clearer, in Italy especially. And you want to stick a finger in their faces. I mean, I'm not only saying this because, Italy was heavily involved in the Macedonian political crisis through Matteo Renzi and his diplomats here. They were openly cheerleading for Zaev and allegedly helping him with all the dirty, deep state machinations he was doing with the wiretaps, but the Italians are not going to stand for this. The Brits are not going to. What would it look like after they voted in a referendum if a plane load after plane load of Eastern Europeans and a boat after boat of migrants from Calais keep coming into the United Kingdom and they still haven't Brexited like 5 years after the referendum? How would these people respond? I mean, it won't be pretty. It can't be pretty. It's pretty is not an option here. A good outcome is not an option here.
Yeah. Let's you bring up the migrants in Italy and whatnot, and I know that Greece has had a real influx, especially in the islands, in the past week, 2 weeks. I think the other day, one of the islands, I can't remember which one, had over 500 immigrants come in one day, which is the largest in
Yeah, it's Lesbos.
year and a half, something like that. Okay, yeah, and they're not, it's becoming an issue again, and I'm not sure how they're going to deal with it. I'm not sure how the European Union is going to deal with it. I'm not sure how Zoran Zaev and his government are going to deal.
Yeah,
with
we're going
it.
to have to deal with it because the new prime minister promised the Lesbodians. I don't want to say the word, the derivative of the. Yeah, okay, fine.
Yes.
The good
Greeks on that
citizens
island.
of islanders of Lesbos, that he's going to
Yes.
reduce the overcrowding in their migrant camp, and what he can do is put everybody on a boat and sail them to Solun, to Salonika, and then obviously within 5 days they'll be in Germany through Macedonia. And he promised this, and he apparently took 10,000 of them after the first wave of boats came. And obviously, as soon as word spread in Turkey that in the migrants who are waiting there, that the ships are sailing again from Lesbos to Piraeus in Athens and to Salonika, obviously a new crowd came of several thousand, because once the route is opened, many more will come, and this is his dilemma right now. I don't really envy him.
Well, let's bring it back to Macedonia, since we are doing this special episode 40 of the Macedonian Content Farmers Podcast on Independence Day. I just had to take a break to get some more ice for my mastica, and I am pouring myself another mastica. Cvetin, I'm going to have more mastica tomorrow too. So this is a friend of mine earlier this summer brought me a full bottle of Grozd, 1 liter, which is very kind of him, and some mastica from, I think it's from the Bigorsky Monastery, very special.
That's a good friend.
Which is, yes, and it's in the fridge. I'm gonna have some of that tomorrow. Right now I'm drinking Grozd, but yeah, we want to bring it back to Independence Day in Macedonia, 28 years as the Republic of Macedonia. We mentioned earlier in the monologue that the Prime Minister is holding a big wingding at the Gradsky Park in Skopje tomorrow. What's that white bandstand called? The Clam,
the
you said,
Skolka,
the Shell.
That's the place where people
Right,
were painting the Star of Kutlas all throughout the past several weeks.
Yes. Any other Independence Day celebrations? Alternative Independence Day celebrations going on in Skopje tomorrow? Do you know? Or actually, we should say, or today. I don't know if this is actually going to drop today or tomorrow.
Yes.
But let's just say any more other celebrations.
There's going to be a lot of protests apparently in Australia. The people there are not going to take this, and they are planning to gather in front of the embassy in Canberra, apparently, and elsewhere. The thing at the Skolka, it's going to be a sorry affair. I mean, I've gone through the program. They're dragging out some singers who would still dare show up for the event after what Tamara has been through. And apparently Tamara is planning to leave the country and move back to Serbia with her sister after the reception she had when she butchered the Macedonian national anthem at the U.S. Embassy 4th of July thing. They're having, an older singer sing this time, even if she loses her career. She doesn't really care much. And obviously some international stuff. You noticed they omitted the word Macedonia from all the promotional material. They're all only saying our country, the state, the republic. They like using the republic now because they think it sounds like distinguished, but it's actually just a cop-out to avoid using the word Macedonia. They drew a map of Macedonia, like a mosaic, which is again something which on the left side we've seen a lot of here. A pluribus, as you would say in the United States, out of the many communities we have, but they don't really say the one. It stops short of saying the one. So they're gonna do some NGO stuff like battery recycling and environmental things, or trained dogs jumping through hoops or whatnot. Traditional food from our country, not from Macedonia. So it's all bland, all washed out. I mean, nothing to be proud about, nothing to to inspire you. I mean, I have very much difficulty imagining who would go fight and, God forbid, die for this country, a country which presents itself in this fashion. Its most important holiday after Ilinden.
Yeah. Well, I think, actually, I know, Cvetin, that the majority of Macedonians in Macedonia and in the regions of Macedonia in the Balkans and around the world will be celebrating the independence of the Republic of Macedonia tomorrow, and looking forward to a time when the people can rightly take back the name which they voted for on September 8, 1991. And that will happen. I'm convinced of that, and I think that's the good news in this. And I think kind of as we get down to closing out this podcast, I want to focus on that, and I'm hoping I know, frankly, that there are people in Macedonia and outside of Macedonia that are trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to, once we get rid of the Zornzaev government, how are we going to restore the rightful name of Macedonia to the Macedonians? And I don't know how it's going to happen. There's people far above my pay grade that have doctorates and things like that can figure this out. My role, as I see it, as an outsider but as an adopted Macedonian, is to simply give encouragement and hope to Macedonians in Macedonia and throughout the world. And I'm looking forward to that when I can come back to Macedonia on September 8 in the future and celebrate, and have the government celebrate, Independence Day of the Republic of Macedonia. And I know that's going to happen. It's just a question.
Yes, it's bound to happen. I mean, it's all this type of pressure. It will inevitably have a reaction. I mean, this is absolutely unseemly to have people who can go to the toilet without asking an embassy for approval beforehand, celebrating the word independence. It's a complete contradiction in terms. I mean, there is nothing independent about the people who are organizing this, doing this, and they're just going through the motions. I mean, I'm sure they would much rather just forget about the whole thing and wait for, I don't know, throw another party for either if we open EU accession talks or if we join NATO or something like that. I mean, this is completely in contradiction with everything they've been working. I mean, obviously the left in Macedonia was not very much in tune with the independence to begin with. I mean, they famously
Right.
The Speaker of Parliament famously wouldn't sign the declaration, so they had to find the Vimero Deputy Speaker of Parliament to sign it. It was difficult to rally, to muster all the lefties to show up at the celebration on the town square, even after the vote on the day of the referendum. And not to mention that obviously the referendum was for the Republic of Macedonia, not North Macedonia. But do you remember it was this mixed question? Do you want to declare independence, or do you, with the option to rejoin the other Yugoslav republics? So it was a cop-out question to begin with, and this was also done to placate the left, who was never from the beginning. The large outcome, the large turnout at the referendum, minus the Albanians who boycotted the referendum because they wanted us to remain in the same state with Kosovo. Albanians to the side. The large turnout masked the fact that the question headed both ways. Do you want to declare independence? But with the option of rejoining, obviously, Serbia in a future federation. So it's difficult for me to acknowledge, but we need to be looking things straight in the eye. And the left was never dedicated to the idea of an independent Macedonia. That's a fact.
So they were calling themselves quote unquote global citizens way back.
Yeah, they were Yugoslav before that. They were they would say that nationalism is a foregone concept and that we are socialists first, Yugoslavs.
Yeah, well, it's as we've talked about in the past, and I know we'll talk about in the future. The future belongs to the nation state, not to some amorphous global government or anything like that. And Macedonia is an independent nation state. It should be an independent nation state, a sovereign independent nation state. That's what the people voted for. That's what the people want. And yet it's under attack. But I guess, it's under attack everywhere throughout the West. It's not just in Macedonia. And we have these folks that are attempting to undermine the sovereignty of each and every single nation state, especially in the West. And that's just, as Ronald Reagan said, each generation basically has to continue to fight for the liberty and the freedom and the independence that generation has, to pass it on to the next generation. It can't be taken for granted, and it just takes a lot of work, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah, it's going to be difficult, but again, there are nations in our region, in our vicinity, which haven't given up on this idea. This was painfully obvious from the previous 30 years of Balkan history, and it's just plain dangerous to be giving up, thinking that you can, like somebody said, you might not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. In this case,
I think it was that was Trotsky, I think. So, in a paraphrase of Trotsky.
I mean, in this case, we might not be interested in a nation state, but then other nation states will be interested for our territory. I mean, I've been pretty bleak throughout this podcast, but this is not just fancy words. This is not just going through the motions of a secularized national celebration today. There is a very good reason why we wanted to declare independence, so we would be able to live in peace and stability. I mean the Macedonians.
And determine your own way.
And we are furiously hacking at the pillars which hold this edifice together, and it's exceptionally dangerous to be doing that.
Yeah. Well, liberty is always an unfinished business. It's always something that has to be worked at. You can never just rest on your laurels and take it for granted. That doesn't mean that you're constantly fighting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. But it's something that requires vigilance, not just in Macedonia, but here in the United States of America and in every other nation state there is, especially in the small L liberal democracies of the world. So, and with that, I think we kind of bring it to a close.
We don't have farmers picks this time, but
yes,
this just recently dropped. We are recording this on the 7th, the day before Independence Day, and the heroic Igor Durlovsky, the opera singer who was tried by Zoran Zaev as a terrorist, and even Zaev's favorite judge wouldn't dare sentence him. He was released. He refused the amnesty and became the absolute hero of the past several years. And Andriana Yanovska, another solid singer. Her heart is also in the right place. They re-sang an old song by Pipi Baftirovsky about Macedonia, which makes, especially at this point, they can deny you, my country, as much as they want, but you're still here. Zavetna is the name of the song, difficult to translate in English. Mm-hmm. And this would be the best way to close the podcast, I believe.
Great. Well, I'm glad you brought that up, and we'll let our listeners enjoy that. Happy Independence Day to you, Cvetin, and your family, as the Republic of Macedonia, and to all our listeners.
Thank you, and I hope we earn it.
Indeed. Take care.
Okay.
Negde ќе те премолчат, негде ќе те сокријат, гроб со гроба ќе покријат. Само ти си безсмртна, жива вода подземна, кај што тонеш ти извираш. Само ти си безсмртна, жива вода подземна, кај што тонеш ти извираш. Векови, векови, заедно ќе
Božace, što da izmislat. Samo ti si besmrtna, živa voda podzemna, kaj što toneš ti izviraš. Samo ti si besmrtna, živa voda podzemna,